Welcome to another episode of Art Conservation Talks. Today we're going to dig into the realm of wooden artifacts. You, our listener, have probably seen wood in, well, countless forms, right? From furniture to carvings, all sorts of things. So today we're going to explore what wood actually is, structurally speaking, the different types, and crucially, why this material, which seems so solid, eventually deteriorates. We'll also get into the often very delicate methods used to preserve wooden heritage. And yeah, touch on a particular pest that gives conservators some serious anxiety. Think of this as your personal deep dive into the ethics, the methods, and sometimes the, let's say, madness of conserving these wooden treasures.
Okay, let's get right into it then, because when you look at a piece of wood, it seems simple, maybe, but fundamentally, wood has this really intricate structure. As you've probably seen in some resources, we can actually think about this structure in terms of different structural planes within the wood itself.
Exactly. And a really key physical property we should probably touch on is specific gravity.
Yep.
Simply put, it tells us how dense a specific wood type is compared to water. And it might sound basic, but this measurement, it actually impacts quite a lot.
Oh, definitely. Things like strength, for one.
Right, strength and also how it might expand or contract, with humidity changes. And even how well something like paint will stick to it.
That's right. Specific gravity, it's essentially a ratio. You take the wood's density compared to water's density. So for instance, if you had a cubic meter of, say, oven dry wood that weighed 500 kilograms, its specific gravity would be zero point 0.5. And you find a whole range of these values across different softwoods and hardwoods, which helps explain why they behave so differently.
And speaking of those differences, let's talk about the cells. The cellular structure difference between hardwoods and softwoods. This is where it gets really interesting under the microscope, right?
It really does. What's fascinating is that in softwoods, most of the material, maybe around 90%, is made up of these long, thin cells. They're called longitudinal tracheids. You can picture them like tiny straws, maybe 2 to 7 millimeters long, and they can be like 100 times longer than they are wide. If you look at a cross section, you'd see these tracheids lined up in pretty regular rows, sort of radiating outwards.
Okay, so these tracheids are the main building blocks in softwoods. And their size, that actually tells us something about the wood's texture too, doesn't it?
Precisely. Yeah, the diameter of those tracheids is, well, a key factor for wood texture. Some woods, like bald cypress or redwood, they have quite wide tracheids, giving them a coarser texture. But then you have others, like yew or eastern red cedar, with much finer tracheids. And many common ones, pine, spruce, they're somewhere in the middle.
And this isn't just, academic knowledge for scientists. This has real-world consequences when we think about preserving these objects, I assume.
Absolutely. The size, and particularly the thickness of the cell walls of the early wood tracheids, those are the ones formed earlier in the growing season that directly influences the wood's surface after it's been, say, planed or sanded. And that surface texture, in turn, affects how well coatings, like paint, can fill the grain or penetrate into the wood. A rougher surface might, well, need more paint for a smooth finish, for example.
Okay, so that paints a picture, no pun intended, of what wood is structurally and those key softwood-hardwood differences at the cell level. Now, let's switch gears a bit. Why does this seemingly tough material start to break down? What makes wood deteriorate over time?
Well, the sources we looked at don't give like a complete checklist of every single decay factor, but the discussions around paints and coatings, they offer some really valuable clues. They show factors that contribute to the degradation of both the wood and the materials applied to it.
Ah, okay. So the very things we put on the wood to protect it can sometimes, ironically, contribute to its decline. How does that work?
Well, take oil-based paints, for example. Over really long periods, the chemical process, oxidation, can lead to these reactive compounds forming within the paint layer. And these compounds potentially could interact with the wood underneath. Also, there's hydrolysis that involves water, which can actually break down the paint film itself, the binder.
So moisture, which we generally link with decay anyway, is also a player when it comes to painted wood specifically.
Exactly. And it's not just the oil binder. Certain pigments or additives in the paint can have an effect too. Like if a paint contains lead white, that can change how the paint film resists certain solvents. That's something conservators have to be super careful about during cleaning or restoration.
Right, that makes perfect sense. You don't want your cleaning method to cause more damage to the original finish. And the paint film itself, how does that break down?
A really common problem is the gradual loss of the binding medium, the stuff holding the pigment together. When that happens, the pigment particles aren't bound properly anymore. You get this sort of chalky, powdery surface that can just rub off easily. And that doesn't just change how it looks, it leaves the wood underneath much more exposed and vulnerable.
And it sounds like the surrounding environment, the conditions the object is kept in, that's a huge factor too.
Oh, absolutely. Big fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity. Those are major concerns, especially for preserving wood with decorative layers like paint or gilding. These changes cause stress within the materials, leading to cracking, flaking, all sorts of damage.
And then there's the threat that really seems to worry conservators:
Yes.
pests.
Yes, exactly. While these specific sources don't dive deep into termites particularly, the mention of insect attack regarding wooden structures definitely highlights the very real threat insects pose.
Okay, so we've got a sense of what wood is, and some ways it deteriorates. Now, the big question: how do we preserve these objects without, as we said, stripping their soul? How do conservators approach this?
Well, the sources really emphasize that conservation is usually a team effort. It's collaborative. Conservators often work very closely with curators, with scientists to figure out the best treatment plan. The goal is often twofold: preserve the object itself, but also improve its appearance for presentation, especially, say, within a historic house context. So it's about finding that balance.
That balance between, yeah, ensuring survival and respecting its history and original context, that
Mhm.
sounds like quite a challenge.
It really is. And understanding the original materials, the original techniques used to make the object, that's absolutely vital. The knowledge of traditional craftspeople is seen as incredibly valuable right alongside academic scientific training. You really need both perspectives.
And I imagine there's some pretty significant ethical questions that come up when you're deciding how much to intervene with an original artifact.
Oh, definitely. For example, how much should you retouch or fill in losses on painted furniture? That's a constant discussion. Conservators have to weigh the desire to make damage less distracting against the importance of not misleading people about the object's age or its history of use. Because sometimes those very signs of wear and tear were crucial for interpreting the object's story.
Right, so sometimes that evidence of time passing is actually part of what makes the object significant. You don't want to erase that.
Precisely. And the decisions made aren't always purely technical or ethical. Practical things come into play too. Things like funding or the priorities of the museum or institution that owns the object. These can sometimes create, well, tensions when balancing pure preservation needs with, say, public appeal or display requirements.
It really sounds like a constant negotiation, a balancing act. And when it comes to the actual hands-on work, what kind of methods are typically used for painted or gilded wood?
There's a whole range of cleaning and consolidation methods, but they always require really careful evaluation first. You have to understand the materials involved and the potential impact of any treatment on the original surfaces. Sometimes the main goal is just to stabilize and preserve the existing paint layers, provided they're well attached, even if they look aged. It's not always about making it look brand new. Sometimes it's about preserving what's there. The key is that deep understanding of the object guiding the choices.
Okay, so ethics, methods, it's it's complex. Now, let's circle back to that pest question we hinted at. Why the specific dread about termites?
Ah, termites.
Yeah.
Well, while the sources mention insect attack generally, termites are particularly insidious because of how they work. They consume the wood from the inside out. Often the outer surface can look relatively okay, almost completely intact until the internal damage is really severe. This means they can cause sudden catastrophic structural failure in wooden artifacts, and because they're hidden, early detection is just incredibly difficult.
Wow, a truly hidden danger. Okay, I can definitely see why they'd cause such concern for anyone caring for wooden objects. So bringing this all together, we've touched on the ethical tightropes, the meticulous methods for analysis and treatment, and the very real challenges, pests included, that make conserving wooden heritage such a demanding field. It's clear it requires very specialized training, ongoing research, and as you said, that crucial sensitivity to the cultural context of these objects.
Indeed, the whole process really highlights this critical intersection, doesn't it? The blend of scientific understanding, artistic sensitivity, and fundamentally ethical responsibility that really defines art conservation.
So you've journeyed with us into this, well, really fascinating world of wooden artifacts, from their tiny cellular structures to the threats they face, and the incredibly careful efforts made to preserve them. Hopefully this deep dive has maybe given you a new appreciation for the complexities hidden within objects we often just take for granted. The field of conservation is always evolving, always striving to better understand and protect our shared material history. What aspects of this discussion maybe spark your curiosity? What other questions do you have now? We definitely encourage you to explore further if you're interested. Thanks so much for joining us on The Deep Dive.